Chris here from geometrical.design. From a very young age, I have always been fascinated by simple shapes. I do recall in my childhood playing with toys that sort of look like these ones here. In fact, I'm pretty sure everybody at some stage in their childhood has played with toys that look like these, or given them to your children in the hope that these toys will enhance brain development. But at the end of the day, these toys just get sucked on despite having no nutritional value. I also recall at the age of 15 excelling at geometry, but when it came to everything else mathematics, I went from top of the class right down to the very bottom. And this was of concern to the teacher, who took me out of his classroom and into his office, and he asked me, of all things, if I had problems at home, which I didn't. But here's the thing, not everybody's brain is geared the same way. I'm no good at mental arithmetic, I was never destined to become an accountant, and I've never held the desire to become a chief financial officer. On the other hand, I always used to wonder why not everybody knows what the chord of a circle is. I've always known since I was first taught it at school, I just don't think I could ever forget it. You see, I really enjoy playing around with simple shapes. For example, the circle, the triangle, the square, and the pentagon. So much so that these shapes formed the foundation of my thesis for my master's degree back in the late last century. I'm showing my age already. And if anybody here suffers from insomnia, I'll put a link to my thesis below. No, just kidding. So one of the reasons why I like these shapes is because they can become complex very quickly. And by complex, I don't mean difficult. What I do mean is beautifully ordered at a detailed level. And in particular, I like to play around with these ratios because these ratios are embedded in these shapes. So one is the square root of 3, or root 3 ratio. The other is the square root of 2, or root 2 ratio. And the third one, I think you may have heard of this one already, the golden ratio. So in this presentation, we are going on a short journey that will meander its way through a range of patterns and designs, and all of these patterns and designs will have something in common, and that is an underlying geometry that brings harmony to the design irrespective of whether the design is simple or complex. But before we do that, I want to quickly go through an incredibly simple exercise. What I would like you to do is have a look at this shape on the screen, the square. So we've got a little blue square, nothing particularly exciting, so I will throw in another shape, a yellow torus, or donut, or you can call it a bagel if you want to, and I'll throw in a few other shapes in there for good measure. But I don't actually want you to look at these shapes. What I would like you to look at is the space in between them. Because the space in between is far more interesting, and this is where I like to spend a lot of my time because I like to use the space to determine the size and location of all of the elements in the design. Now the grid that you see in the background here is made up of pentagons and circles drawn within pentagons and circles. And the reason why I like working with grids like this is they introduce a sense of asymmetry to a design. So we've got symmetry and asymmetry built into the same background here. And this is another grid. So this is a grid which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. It's a grid of equidistant lines. And compared to the previous grid, this is just so incredibly boring. And the reason why, it just keeps showing up or throwing up the same shapes all the time. Those shapes just being boring old squares. Compare that to the grid on the right. Now this grid is far more interesting because it is also made up of squares, but they are squares drawn within circles, within squares drawn within circles. And I like working with grids like this because again, they introduce asymmetry and complexity into a design. The idea here is to really just demonstrate how geometry can be used to establish the size and location of all of the elements in a design. So let's have a look at something with more of a historical context. Here we have an Islamic star pattern. Now this pattern didn't just spring into existence out of nowhere. It is what the original designer wants us to see, but what is missing is the underlying geometry, the geometric framework or construction that had to exist before this pattern came into existence. So let's just have a look at what's in the background. And we see the very same grid that we saw earlier. Now this is unlikely to be the grid that the designer or craftsperson used originally, but it does correlate perfectly with this design. And I'd like to just touch on a few more things here, and that is, this design exhibits a degree of complexity, as well as that asymmetrical and proportional arrangement of space. If you look at the spaces within that design, from the outside in, they all vary in size and shape, but they all exist in harmony. This particular design has some very simple origins. So starting with a simple shape like this, all we are doing is rotating that design, and the design also has 10 planes of reflection. And for most people, that's about all they see. A lot of people look past the asymmetry within this pattern. That is, they don't see or register the asymmetry, and it is asymmetry that surrounds us every day in the natural world. It is asymmetry that brings a sense of growth to a design. And it's asymmetry that does not just easily spring from a grid of regular or equidistant lines. And when we look at a pattern like this, we can see that geometry can incorporate simplicity, complexity, symmetry, and asymmetry into one harmonious design. Over time, there have been a number of architectural styles that have come and gone, and at their height, geometry has always played an important part. What we have here is an example of a Gothic trefoil or trefoil window. It's not as geometric as the Islamic pattern we saw earlier, but geometry did play an important part in the construction of this window. I've added some of the geometry used to construct this window. I haven't put all of it in there, but the point I wanted to make is geometry is also used to determine the size and location of all of the spaces in this design. So those are the spaces within which the glass will fit. So just coming forward in time to the arts and crafts movement, and we have something here that does not have the appearance of being geometric. This is a variation of a William Morris design, and I put this variation together just to illustrate how geometry can be used to determine the size and location of every leaf, every berry, every fruit, every flower, including the curvature of every branch. Now I'd like to come back to this design, or more importantly to the grid that we see drawn behind it. Now this is the grid of pentagons that we saw earlier. Pentagons drawn within circles within pentagons. And the reason for this is it segues nicely into the golden ratio. Because the golden ratio can be found within this grid 1,000 times over. It's just everywhere. But just to demonstrate, what I would like to do is pull out an element from within this grid. I don't know whether you can see the stars within the grid. This will make it more obvious. Here we have a typical 5-pointed star. So it's a star we see on flags around the world, including the New Zealand flag. I just wanted to show the relationship on how you can find the golden ratio within this 5-pointed star. So here we go. Length A divided by length B equals length B divided by length C equals length C divided by length D, which equals the golden ratio. And you're probably wondering, big deal, right? I mean, how does this apply to the world around us? So I thought I'd take a picture of a flower just to demonstrate this. What we've got here is your typical garden variety daisy. I just took this photo at random from the garden. we can start to see the flower correlates well with the circles that are related to each other by the golden ratio. That is, radius A divided by radius B equals radius B divided by radius C, which equals the golden ratio. So at least we can now start to see how the golden ratio relates to what we see in the natural world. But that's not all, because you'll also find the golden ratio in your pocket. That is, if you have, for example, an iPhone. And you will find it there many times over, along with the other ratios that I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm not a party to Apple's design secrets. It's just that when I see a design and I think the golden ratio is in there, I like to check it out. So here we have the grid again, and just showing where the golden ratio can be found. And what we are doing here is drawing 3 circles. We are going to duplicate one of them and make it orange. So we have used the grid to determine the size of these circles, and now we are going to use the grid to determine the location of these circles. And what you end up with is an exact match to the weather icon on your iPhone. And Apple's use of the golden ratio is no secret, because in 2013 they released this grid to the world. And you may have actually seen it on your iPhone as well, or even your iPad, because if an app icon does not display correctly, you see this icon grid instead. And within this icon grid you also find the golden ratio, a nice asymmetric arrangement of space. And here we go again. Length A divided by length B equals length B divided by length C equals length D divided by length E, which equals the golden ratio. Now there is something missing from here, because we also have another ratio, and that is the square root of 2. And again, this is one of those big deal moments. I mean, who comes across this ratio every day? Well, actually, chances are you do. In fact, a lot of people in their business lives handle this ratio in their hands every day. And what is it? It's that piece of paper you put through the photocopier or printer. And what you will find is that if you look at the length of this paper and divide it by the width, it equals the square root of 2. And this particular rectangle is unique in the entire universe. It's the only rectangle that you can fold in half, and in half again, and you can go on forever folding it in half. Each of those smaller rectangles have the same proportions as the parent. That is, the length of each subsequent rectangle when divided by its width equals the square root of 2, and that is why it is such a handy piece of paper. So we're beginning to see that the golden ratio and those other ratios I mentioned pretty much correlate to a lot of what we see in the natural world and also within the products that we buy. But here is the caveat. Nothing in this world is perfectly straight. Nothing in this world is perfectly round. It's always a bit on the lumpy side. People's faces are not perfectly bilaterally symmetrical. Not even the stunningly handsome guys like this one right here. And starfish are not perfectly radially symmetrical. And when it comes to the natural world, or the world that has been designed for us, the golden rectangle does not correlate exactly with anything. And the reason is, it just doesn't have to, because we live in a perfectly imperfect world, where the perfection we seek only exists in our imagination. And it's this perfectly imperfect world that gives rise to the characteristically regular patterns that we readily recognize. And although these cells in this honeycomb all look the same, in reality they all vary in size just a fraction. The walls in those cells vary in thickness just a fraction. It's just perfectly imperfect. And this perfectly imperfect world also gives rise to the characteristically irregular shapes that we see every day. And I can pretty much guarantee that everybody watching this video has never seen this cloud before, and you will never ever see it again, because the molecules in this cloud will never arrange themselves in exactly the same way ever again. And in fact, within a week or so of taking this photo, the molecules from this cloud have probably dispersed themselves halfway across the planet. And yet, when we see a cloud, we recognize this characteristic irregularity and we immediately know what it is. So we're starting to wrap up here. Probably the best way to describe my thesis, if I can call it that, is when we look at natural forms, we can establish a correlation between what we see and geometry. We can use these correlations to discern some design principles, which we can then apply to the world we design. From the study of the spatial properties of these three simple shapes, creativity can be expanded in unlimited directions, yet stay grounded in a geometric framework that relates what we design to the world around us. Within those simple shapes, we can incorporate symmetry, asymmetry, simplicity, and complexity into the products that we design. I am a space explorer, and I would like to invite you to begin exploring the space in between. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and if you did, press the like button below and subscribe to this channel. See ya!